Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Sunday to you. This is the last day of the 2025 Antalya Diplomacy Forum. I think one of the advantages of being the first show of the day is that you can start on time and you're not affected by the domino effect. I'd like to welcome our esteemed panelists and our distinguished guests in the audience to this critical discussion on confronting discrimination and racism in the 21st century. As we gather here at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, we are reminded of the challenges, the persistent challenges that xenophobia, Islamophobia, and racism pose to our societies. Recent reports have highlighted a troubling surge in racist incidents across Europe. Let me give you a quick stat to begin with. France's Interior Ministry documented 16,000 racist, xenophobic, and anti-religious crimes in 2024. That is a double-digit increase when compared to the previous year. On a more hopeful note, over at the United Nations Human Rights Council, Turkey has called for the appointment of a special envoy on Islamophobia. Now, these developments highlight the evolving nature of racism, which continues to manifest through exclusionary nationalism and discriminatory rhetoric that challenges the core principles of our democratic societies. Our panel today aims to look at some of these issues. We'll explore strategies on how to uphold universally recognized values of human dignity and equality in the face of rising racial as well as ethnic divides. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce our esteemed panelists. Please welcome Evren Dadelen Akgün, the OSCE chairperson in office as personal representative on combating intolerance and discrimination against Muslims. Good morning, Ambassador. She leads OSCE efforts to counter anti-Muslim hatred across member states, drawing on her diplomatic experience to promote human rights, inclusion, and intercommunal understanding through both policy development and field engagement. Next, we're joined by Mehmet Pacacı, Special Envoy of the OIC Secretary General on combating Islamophobia. A seasoned diplomat and respected scholar, Ambassador Pacacı represents the OIC's commitment to global cooperation in combating Islamophobia and upholding the dignity and rights of Muslim communities around the world. To his right, Marion Lalisse, please welcome her, the European Commission's coordinator on combating anti-Muslim hatred. Good morning, Marion. She works at the intersection of EU policy and civil society, advancing strategies to address discrimination, hate speech, and systemic bias while safeguarding Europe's core values of human rights and pluralism. Salman Said, professor from the University of Leeds, a leading voice in social theory, Islamophobia studies, and decolonial thought. His work challenges conventional understandings of race and identity in democratic societies, offering a critical lens on how exclusion and racialization persist within modern liberal frameworks. Finally, we welcome Professor Şener Aktürk of Koç University, an expert in comparative politics and ethnic diversity as well as nationalism. His research offers empirical insights into how political systems manage pluralism and what happens when state structures institutionalize forms of exclusion or discrimination. We have a very qualified group of experts. I thank you for your participation. I'd like to begin our 60-minute session with a rapid fire round. If each of you, in order, we can call them opening statements, you can call them an assessment of the current situation, but let's set the stage for the debate to come. Ambassador?
Oh, okay. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, dear colleagues. The rapid fire, I'm not very familiar with the terminology, but I think that is what we need. It seems to me that the more we pursue more inclusive societies, the more discrimination manifests itself today in our societies. I will inevitably refer to anti-Muslim hatred, since that is my area. But of course, we have problems for other communities as well. But for me, anti-Muslim hatred, what I can definitely say, and you alluded to it as well, is surging unabatedly in multiple ways for all individuals. And it's affecting the targeted communities, it's affecting the objects of these acts, and it's affecting everyone in between. So we are up against an important wall that we need to obviously surmount. The recent findings of many institutions, but I'm going to refer to the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, found last November, I think, right, that 1 out of every 2 Muslims faces daily discrimination, if not harassment. There are other important findings in that report. It looks at 13 EU countries, not all of them, but the trends, even in those 13 countries, are quite alarming. So acts of discrimination and racist hatred and violence based on religion or ethnicity obviously strike at the heart of our democracies and erode the fabrics of our society, if not ultimately our humanity. So it's high time we approach this problem with a goal-oriented mindset. We need to move from a realistic perspective. We are trying to do this, but I don't think we are quite aware of all the implications. We seem to be responding, again, I'm talking for anti-Muslim hatred, treating the symptoms. And treating the symptoms is not going to get us to cohesive societies. So firstly, we need to recognize that anti-Muslim hatred is real. And by whatever name we call it, it is a form of racism. It needs to be addressed with an understanding that it is a punishable crime. Impunity, if coupled with a rhetoric that perpetuates and normalizes hatred, is going to constantly put us in a loop of anti-Muslim discourse and acts. We have some insights, and we have representatives, very distinguished representatives of academia here, but we have information that keep flowing in from academia that points to a troubling pattern, and that pattern is that the more racism and Islamophobia infiltrate democratic institutions, the more erosion of representation, freedoms, and equality. Mm-hmm. And there is a vicious circle, because all of this then leads to a disenfranchisement, let's say, of the targeted communities, who are then unable to take part in the democratic process, and you have a legitimacy question then. And all of this turns back in on us, and we find ourselves in a loop where we cannot effectively address discrimination, racism, xenophobia, hatred.
We'll look at ways throughout the continuing conversation how we can get out of this vicious circle.
Okay.
Ambassador Pacheco?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, Excellencies, esteemed colleagues, distinguished guests, and my fellow panelists. It's about an honor and a profound responsibility to address this esteemed assembly on the critical challenge of confronting discrimination and racism in our contemporary world. Despite significant strides made through human rights movements and legal reforms, racism and discrimination continue to manifest in evolving forms. Institutionalized biases, exclusionary nationalism, and xenophobia have resurged, often under the guise of cultural identity or security concerns. First and foremost, these developments pose significant threats to the foundational principles of democratic societies, which are built upon participation, representation, and human dignity. A particularly alarming rise of Islamophobia, a form of racism and xenophobia that targets individuals and communities based on their religion or belief. The OIC has observed with deep concern the proliferation of negative stereotypes, hate speech, and discriminatory practices against Muslims, especially in Western societies. Such narratives not only marginalize Muslims, but also contribute to social fragmentation and undermine efforts towards peaceful coexistence. Directly speaking, the OIC regards anti-Muslim discriminatory narrative as a form of racism and xenophobia that contradicts the principles of human rights. These narratives result in hate crimes, discrimination in employment and education, and restricted access to public services. The OIC particularly concerned about the rising influence of far-right groups and ideologies globally. These movements often propagate xenophobic, racist, and Islamophobic rhetoric, posing serious threats to social cohesion and international peace. Modern racism, deeply embedded within political, economic, and social structures, discriminatory policies, racial profiling, and the disproportionate impact of global crisis on marginalized communities are indicative of systematic discrimination. The statistics, as you pointed out, Mr. Moderator, are staggering and heartbreaking. In the United States, for instance, a prominent Muslim civil rights organization reported nearly 9,000 complaints of anti-Muslim bias in 2024, the highest number since 1996. In Europe, documented cases of anti-Muslim hatred increased by 43% in just 1 year, surpassing 6,000 incidents. In Australia, in Far East, Islamophobic harassment has doubled in the past 2 years, with women and girls disproportionately targeted both online and in physical attacks. These figures are not mere statistics, in fact. They represent real people, mothers, fathers, and children who live in fear simply because of their faith.
Okay.
The global rise of far-right ideologies has normalized anti-Muslim rhetoric. Normalized anti-Muslim rhetoric, creating a dangerous climate of dehumanization that affects nearly 1.5 billion Muslims worldwide. Mainstream media networks have amplified this crisis, perpetuating Islamophobic narratives and conspiracy theories that infiltrate public discourse and policymaking. This normalization of hatred has dire consequences, not only for Muslims, but for all of us, for all humanity. It erodes social cohesion, the principles of democracy and pluralism that are essential for the peaceful coexistence of different religions or beliefs, excludes communities and undermines the principles of equality and justice that we hold dear. Anti-Muslim racism is not just a Muslim issue, it is a human rights issue, a challenge that threatens the dignity and security of all marginalized groups. Perhaps in this session, in this part of our panel, that's
thank you, Ambassador.
to describe the situation as...
Thank you for that setup, and we'll get into the unique position and the role, the important role that the OIC can play in just a little bit. Marianne, good morning to you. Let's start off with some opening comments.
Thank you very much, dear panelists and dear member of the audience. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today. I wanted to start by saying that democracy, fundamental rights, the rule of law are too often taken for granted. But in fact, it's an everyday fight to maintain those values, which are enshrined in our treaties, in our charters, in international convention. We should be remembered that it's not always a smooth road, but a bumpy one, and they are back and forth. And being a democracy is not a label that you get for good. It's a label that you win every single day, and that gives you a lot of responsibilities to lead by example. And many countries may think that the grass is greener at home. They are probably wrong, because racism is extremely widespread, and at all times did we witness forms of racism and discrimination. It might be indeed there in the EU against Muslims, against black people, Roma, also anti-Asian sentiments, anti-Semitism obviously, and other forms. It might be here as well against Christians, against Jews, Kurds, Alevis, and others. So we do have responsibilities all together to make sure that we fight against these forms of racism and discrimination. And Evren rightly so mentioned that 1 out of 2 Muslims in the EU face racial discrimination. It's also the same figure for black people in the EU. And Roma are often the most hated group in our society, and we should be reminded that they are all parts of the EU. They are part and parcel of our identity, and we are so proud that our identities are diverse. So I think it's a question of looking at ourselves in the mirror and acknowledging the presence of racism and discrimination, to also be able to tackle structural racism, not only interpersonal discrimination. So indeed, I think we have racism against Muslims, because you've rightly mentioned that racism has evolved from ethnic considerations to cultural and religious ones. And I'm also very concerned about the fate of Muslims throughout the world, in India, in China, in Myanmar, in the US, in Canada, Australia, and obviously also in Europe. And I look forward to working together with international partners on that. Finally, maybe to say that we are proud to support strong organizations such as ECAR, the European Coalition of Cities Against Racism, with cities also inside Turkey, including Istanbul and Antalya. And these kind of partnerships helps tackling the root causes of racism, anti-Muslim racism as well, anti-Semitism, and gender discrimination at the city level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marianne, and we'll get back to you, and so you can sort of expand on some of the many topics that you mentioned. Professor?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the Italia Diplomacy Forum and the panelists. There seems to be a lot of consensus about what we've already talked about, so let me just make my comments really brief. One, as has already been said, Islamophobia is not a Western problem, it's a world problem. Two, I think it's important to recognize that democracy and liberalism are completely and totally compatible with racism. And this is important not just to score points, but to realize that you need to make the effort to make democracy and liberalism something which is anti-racist and in particular anti-Islamophobia. Three, I think it's important to recognize too that we have a certain paradox when we talk about racism today. I don't know of, with the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa, there isn't any regime in the world which says it's overtly racist. most political parties which were racist would say they're not racist, and they will bring out the Muslim or the one lonely black member or someone to demonstrate they're not racist. So we live in a world where there are no racists, but racism persists. And that, I think, is an interesting paradox to deal with this, because we can't simply, nobody wants to be called a racist, but they don't mind doing racism. And that raises two particular questions for forums like this. We often get people coming here making very important statements, very important principles, and at the same time, we also have to suspend our judgment that those important principles and those important statements are never practiced in the way that they're stated. Now, there's always going to be a certain amount of distance between what people say and what people do, but at some level, when that becomes too great, the whole enterprise loses legitimacy. And in regard to the question around this, racism is really, really problematic, and Islamophobia. One of the largest culprits, the largest promoters of Islamophobia are governments, are political actors. And Islamophobia is not simply a response, a cultural response or an individual response. It is a political, and it is a political, something outcome of a political strategy, but not a political strategy that is an instrument. It is actually what it is. Islamophobia is the way that the contract between rulers and ruled is being rewritten in many, many parts of the world. And the reason why it's Islamophobia is because Islamophobia now has become the stream where all racism can be expressed. Like I said, nobody wants to be called a racist, but there are liberals who will say, I am proud to be an Islamophobe. Now that is an interesting paradox, but the other thing about Islamophobia is this, that it is nothing to do with Islam or Muslims, partly because anyone can be tainted by this. The legislation that has been brought in to deal with, for example, or practices which are Islamophobic do not just stop at Muslims. Take, for example, the executive order that prevents certain people from entering the United States for educational purposes. It was originally meant to be stopping, those radical Muslims, and who doesn't want to stop radical Muslims? But now we have French scientists who are not Muslim being stopped. We also have other people being stopped for these things. We have erosion of the way that we think society should work on the basis that Islamophobia is now being used to put us in a very different relationship between the rulers and the ruled, whether the rulers are private or public. And therefore, the combat against Islamophobia and racism isn't so much a combat for democracy and liberalism, it's actually a combat for the future of just societies and the possibility of just societies.
Yes. Great stuff. And I'd be interested to get into the normalization of this racism in our next round. Professor?
Thank you very much to the fellow panelists, and especially to our audience members in this last day of a very thought-provoking forum. So I'd like to start my remarks by paraphrasing a very famous maxim: a spectre is haunting Europe and the world, and it is the spectre of equality and equal representation. Much of what we talk about today, in my opinion, Islamophobia, racism, discrimination, is a reaction of societies in Europe, in North America, in the Middle East, in South Asia, East Asia, and around the world, to the real prospect of equality, which is a cliche, but the idea that every human being has the right to vote and to be represented in proportion of their population. This has not been realized at all in many parts of the world, including in the core Euro-American countries. Just to give two examples from our published research on 26 European countries, Muslim populations are represented only about 1/3 of their size of the population in European parliaments. To give the most dramatic example, by far the Western country with the largest Muslim origin population, proportionally in absolute numbers, is France. If Muslims were proportionately represented in the French Parliament, Assemblée Nationale, we would regularly have something like 42 Muslims in Assemblée Nationale. I'm talking about mainland France, not Mayotte, not 100% Muslim islands. Instead, what we have on average is about 4. So on average, we have only 10% On average, we have 36, 38 Muslim members missing in the French parliament in a regular session. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because that's descriptive representation, right? Because many of the Muslim representatives are not necessarily representing Muslim interests, and that's not their, and they don't have to. Especially lacking is the representation of, religious conservative Muslims, which is not the majority, true, but a very important segment of the Muslim population. So leaving aside United Kingdom, which is exceptional in terms of its relative multiculturalism, in all of continental Europe, you would be hard-pressed to find any Muslim origin representative who is, campaigning in a mosque, fasting in the Ramadan, wearing the headscarf in all of continental Europe, because those are particularly stigmatized. And then you have policy bans, such as the constitutional ban of minarets in Switzerland, bans on wearing of headscarf in many European countries, ban on ritual animal sacrifice, which is absolutely necessary for halal and kosher meat, which is banned in much of Northern Europe and Northwestern Europe, attempted bans of male children's circumcision across all of the Scandinavian countries, which targets another age-old Muslim and Jewish religious tradition, and examples can be multiplied. We have published, printed. I'm happy to distribute any of these reports to you after the panel if you want. So it's not only the lack of representation, one person, one vote, so we are not there, we are far from there. And this is not only a minority problem, I mind you. In many parts of the world, the most burning example for me and maybe for this audience is Syria. The majority was excluded from representation for 50 plus years, with 500,000 people mass murdered in the hands of an autocratic ideological minority regime until 3 months ago. Right? So it's the representation of minorities and majorities, depending on which part of the world we are looking at. And the spectrum goes from hate speech to genocide, which is the most extreme example of denying the humanhood of many, unfortunately, and this is not a coincidence, Muslim populations, the Uyghur Muslims, the Rohingya in Myanmar, Crimean Tatars in Crimea, Palestinians in historic Palestine, and until recently, the great majority of Syrian, mostly Arab Sunni populations. So it's not just one great power, it's just that France and China and India and Myanmar and we can count. So it is a global problem of representation, substantive representation in particular, and I'm fortunate in following dear ambassadors and my colleague, because I'm going to build up on some of that in terms of, no one, Professor Said says I'm a racist. So with what kind of discourse enables this kind of exclusion? I'll identify just one, because we don't have more time for that. This fictitious distinction between native and immigrant origin, newcomer origin, right? That is used to mass murder Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, Muslims and Jews across European history in Europe, in Crimea, elsewhere. This is fictitious. A person can be immigrant if he or she in his lifetime migrates to a different place. But how is it that, again, for example, French Muslims who have been under French rule in Algeria for 195 years, Algeria became French in 1830. How can one consider them immigrant? They are as native to France as all of the Eastern European nation states that were established much later than 1830. So this distinction is only used, and I'm not just talking about, I'm picking France because it's such a huge and important country, not that this is not a problem in all the other countries around the world. This distinction, native versus immigrant origin, I'm not talking about immigrant, but immigrant origin, or autochthonous versus newcomer, is almost always used to build a hierarchy of rights with full rights bearers and some lower caste, sons of the soil versus people who arrived 150 years ago. What does that even mean? I mean, everyone arrives. And a similar discourse of that, its representation in the European discourse, again, since we are, so in many ways, geographically, many of us are European, the idea of why is it Christian Europe? It's also Jewish Europe, it's also Muslim Europe. Muslims and Jews and Christians have been inhabiting Europe for over 1,000 years. As I've again discussed in some recent work, in medieval Europe you had vibrant majority Muslim population in Sicily, in Italy, in southern France, in Portugal, in Spain, and Jews have been in Europe over 1,000 years, just as Christianity arrived from Palestine, from Nazareth, Prophet Jesus, to Europe as a new religion. Islam and Judaism also arrived in Europe as a new religion slightly later. So this idea that one continent, whether it's Asia or Africa or Europe, is an exclusive domain of one native religion or sect, I think is another discourse that enables and facilitates, I think, discrimination. So representation, I think, is very important, both for the minorities and for the majorities. That's why I gave the example of Syria, where almost 90% of the population was excluded from representation through genocidal methods until recently, but minority representation in more consolidated democratic countries. But not just token representation, but substantive representation, representing different lifestyles. So that's why I brought up the issue of bans on minarets, or call to the prayer, or ritual animal sacrifice, male circumcision, headscarves, praying 5 times a day, all kinds of visibility of different religions, rituals, and sects in the public domain. And finally, the discourse that has to be, I think, revised to reflect that every religion and sect, after a generation or two, should be accepted as indigenous and native, that this fictitious idea that there are some sons of the soil and then there are some newcomers, which in a very large number of cases are supposedly Muslims are the newcomers, because it's a slightly younger religion, right, than the others that we are, because we are talking about some 1,000+ years already. I think this is a discourse that should not be taken for granted and should be countered in the public, to say, what do you mean by native versus immigrant origin? Is the person born abroad? No, then, what does it matter whether his great-grandfather arrived from Ossetia or from whatnot? So that's the 3 major points I'd like to bring to our attention.
I definitely want to come back to the analytical, comparative, and even semantic angles that you brought up. Professor Said, let me ask you. Everyone was talking about the root cause. I mean, when you look at sort of liberal democracies, in essence, they're championing pluralism, tolerance. How do you explain the persistence of a concept like Islamophobia?
Well, I don't think they've been championing liberal tolerance and pluralism. Liberalism has been compatible with imperialism. It's been compatible with slavery, mass slavery. It has been compatible with all kinds of things. And in the combat between liberalism and Democrats, the liberals were actually not in favor of popular votes or popular sovereignty. So the reason is, what we talk about liberalism, it has been changed through struggles to broaden its ambit. Remember that up till about 1960s, the two, Britain and France, had a situation where 90 to 80% of the population they ruled had no political rights, or virtually no political rights. But they were still considered, and you can look at textbooks, and this applies to the Netherlands, the United States. You can look at textbooks, and they will talk about these countries as being the beacons of democracy and liberalism, because you forget about empire, etc. Haiti was paying reparations for freeing itself from France until very recently. So I think it's really, really important that we don't take the stories that are told about liberalism and democracy today as being the same stories that have existed from the beginning of time. And the reason why that is necessary, because without that knowledge, we don't have the means and mechanisms to actually see where we are right now. So the reason why we're talking about Islamophobia, the reason why we're talking about the upsurge in things, is partly to do with the way that Islamophobia has been emerging for a very long time, the last 30, 40, 50 years at least, in acceleration, but also because of what is happening in Gaza. And what we have seen is liberal institutions, let's forget about governments for a minute, universities, who will defend to the death the right of academic freedom, except when it comes to right to protest in favor of Palestinians or in favor or against genocide. These are liberal institutions. They don't have to act like that. But we never hear that, tired of hearing from them, that no, we are really, really interested in freedom of speech. The Charlie Hebdo affair and other affairs like the cartoons in Denmark, Muslims had to bear Voltaire being quoted at them again and again. I disagree with everything you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Whatever happened to Voltaire now? No one quotes Voltaire considering what's happening in the American universities.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be recognize the story about liberalism and democracy is not the story that is necessarily useful. It is part of the problem that we need to start thinking about what kind of world that we want to live in which it is possible to think about justice, which goes beyond simply the only way you can have justice is the way that it was achieved for a short period of time between 1945 till 2023.
Okay. Marian, let me turn to you. If that isn't the story of liberal democracies anymore, I think one angle could be, correct me if I'm wrong, in some member state countries, the political discourse may be borderline institutional Islamophobia. How does the European Commission balance anti-discrimination goals with national sovereignty?
Indeed. So indeed, member states have a lot of competences, and the EU has a mandate to support member states in combating racism and discrimination, but does not have full power. And we do see a normalization of hatred in the political discourse, in mainstream media, in some part of the media, and we are fully aware about that. And together with my colleague, who is coordinator on combating racism, Michaela Moa, and my peer on anti-Semitism, Katharina von Schnorbein, we are trying to address this normalization. We had a recent meeting in Brussels with journalists and with ethical boards, with national press councils, and member states were attending, international organizations as well. And we wanted to raise awareness about this normalization and to prevent it. Obviously, you have media who do a good job in documenting hatred and specifically anti-Muslim hatred or racism. But you have others who play because they know you can earn money out of it, and you can cover Muslims under the specific angle of terrorism and migration, which will spread fear and will lead to social tensions, instead of looking at the Muslim or the migrant or autochthonous minorities in their daily life as contributing to society. So, and one key message of that interaction with journalists was Muslims need to be part of the discussion. You are not talking about Muslim, but Muslims should be there in the discussion, and they should be at all levels, including management of media. As much as we have a vice president of the parliament, Younous Omarjee, who is racialized, as much as we have a commissioner, Hadj Al Habib, from Belgium, or a president of the council, Antonio Costa, who is racialized, I would say, we need to have in the media, in the executive boards, Muslims and other minorities in Europe, or people who are perceived as such. So our role is to guide member states and to look at good practices, because we don't have so much stick. We do have some, but not enough. Maybe you could say. We have rule of law report every year, and there are some important findings on civil society, for instance, on shrinking of civic society. And we have also FRA report, the report of the Fundamental Rights Agency, and we are also preparing a strategy against racism, which will obviously cover as well Muslims. And this helps us to hold regular discussions and to also hold member states accountable when there are clear issues at home.
Okay. Marian, thank you. Ambassador Pacic, if I could turn to you. Marian said Muslims need to be involved. I think it's fair to say that the OIC has a moral authority in Muslim majority countries. I'm wondering how your organization can effectively influence the global discourse when it comes to Islamophobia, when it's being used as a political tool.
Yes, thank you. Well, in this regard, I would like to underline the rise of far-right ideologies. Actually, is a particularly grave concern, and it's becoming a kind of pandemic in the world. And their infiltration into mainstream political discourse exacerbates division and undermines social harmony. To counter this, the OIC calls for international cooperation to monitor, investigate, and address far-right extremism. That becomes a kind of, as I said, a pandemic in the world, not only in the West, but also in other parts of the world, is appearing more and more. It urges all international stakeholders to acknowledge anti-Muslim hatred and racism as a contemporary form of intolerance and religious discrimination. In pursuit of addressing religious incitement and intolerance, the OIC has sponsored the United Nations resolutions aimed at combating defamation of religions. These efforts culminated in the adopting of Resolution 1618, which calls upon states to foster religious freedom and pluralism and to counter intolerance through dialogue, education, and public debate, rather than the criminalization of speech. This resolution reflects a consensus on the need to protect individuals from discrimination while adopting the freedom of expression. And beside that, these efforts reflect commitment to balancing freedom of expression with the prohibition of incitement to hatred, as enshrined in Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Likewise, UNHRC Resolution 53/1 also calls upon states to adopt national laws, policies, and law enforcement frameworks that address, prevent, and prosecute acts and advocacy of religious hatred that constitute incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence, and to take immediate steps to ensure accountability. United Nations Resolutions 76254, designing March 15 as International Day to Combat Islamophobia, is rooted in the principles of United Nations Charter and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This resolution recalls several key documents, other key documents like addressing, combating intolerance, negative stereotyping, stigmatization, discrimination, incitement to violence, and violence against individuals based on religion or belief. And other resolutions like 75/188, excuse me, 36/55, 73/296 in this regard and in the same character. So, in international arena, the OIC's efforts made the international community to produce that kind of resolutions and to fight against Islamophobia and to fight against racism. And again, the OIC calls upon states to adopt robust legal frameworks, promote responsible media practices, and encourage accurate representation of Muslims in educational curricula and public discourse on the basis of these resolutions.
Good.
Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ibrahim, the Ambassador the last point that he was talking about was the need to create legal frameworks. Marianne was also talking about something similar in terms of what Europe was doing, in terms of the frameworks that need to be set up. From the OSCE's perspective, talk to me about some of the abilities and the goals that this organization has in terms of combating anti-Muslim sentiment.
Well, the OSCE itself is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. It is a product of the Cold War days. And because of that, from the global context that it was born in, it has had a very, I feel, a very visionary and long-term look at the problems back then at hand, and again still facing us today. I'm going to address the question that you asked in a more direct way, but I do find a lot of merit in emphasizing one more time the fact that the OSCE considers the human dimension a part of security. It was, again, born out of different conditions maybe 50 years ago, but today it's more relevant, perhaps, the human dimension as part of our collective security. The legal frameworks in general, not particular to OSCE, in general, I feel need to be in tandem with the evolving of the multicultural context that we are living in today. Multiculturalism is with us, it's here to stay. Multiculturalism as a terminology has been with us for a long time, but I think the merits of it have been lost among the myriad of challenges that we have faced, not least, of course, the political context in the Middle East and the rest. So for the OSCE, as I said, it has had a very visionary look at the issues at hand. Going to 1990 Copenhagen document, there have been, non-discrimination issues have been addressed. And from there on, almost all ministerial councils have looked at this question, non-discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and slowly evolving to particularities with anti-Semitism, anti-Christian hatred, anti-Muslim hatred. So there is a very strong understanding and evaluation of these problems. There are, again, as much as there is an understanding of the problem, there are certain toolkits that have been developed. The Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights of the OSCE, based in Warsaw, is one of the prime elements, let's say, that we have at hand, that looks at these issues, that studies these issues. I can go into detail on what ODIHR, as we refer to them in short, does later on. But that toolkit, what ODIHR does, serves both as an early warning system for the countries to see where they are going with these problems, and also a toolkit of solutions where the countries can go for training or go for assistance in draft laws. So there are a lot of mechanisms that are at the OSCE's, disposal. The OSCE obviously covers a very wide range of, geographical. It has a big makeup, a geographical makeup, going from the Central Asian countries to Canada and America, and you have obviously a very complex web of societal, governmental structures that are going, at the end of the day, converge on these common commitments. So the countries have come together, even though they have different challenges, have come together and actually agreed on very important commitments throughout OSCE's history.
Professor, I know you want to follow up.
I just want to follow up because I think you made a really, really important point, and that is that we've talked a lot about what is wrong, and we've talked about a lot what needs to be done against, but I think we need to also make an argument for, and I think what you said about multiculturalism is really, really important. We live in a world which is quite paradoxical. A lot of international organizations like banks and universities will demonstrate that they are multicultural in essence. You look at their brochures, they're full of people of color, they're people, and they emphasize that. You go to any major world city, you'll find cuisine from all over the world, etc. But the argument that has been lost has been on the virtues of multiculturalism.
Exactly.
And I think one of the things that we could do, more than just legislative elements, is to make the case, again, for why it is important for us to be multicultural, because ultimately the world itself is multicultural. And that, I think, goes back to the point what you were saying about this kind of loss of equality. We are dealing with the fact that there's a decentering, or a kind of Europe has to become part of the world rather than apart from the world. The same applies for America. So I think one of the things we could do is these educational, cultural programs which make the case for multiculturalism, which is already insipid everywhere, but make it much more voraciously and much more in the teeth of those who deny it. And say, look, this is not only a good thing, it is a necessary thing, and it is good not because of virtue, because ultimately the thing about multiculturalism, the thing about diversity, is that it leads to greater creativity, in the sense that newness comes out of contact with strangeness, and we only become more creative when we encounter diversity.
I'm going to play the devil's advocate in just a bit, but Professor... go.
Thank you. So 2 points to follow up on these. One, all of the negative symptoms we are talking about, I think, are healthy symptoms in the sense that they are provoked by the fear of equality. That the idea that far right and other, discriminatory actors see that a world where people of different faiths and colors and ethnicities might really become a reality, that they are reacting to this. This is the first point. But the second point I disagree with, if I didn't misunderstand it, we haven't yet experienced multiculturalism, I think. That's just an aspiration. I mean, the descriptive kind of, yes, the food and the colors, but that's just the packaging. The idea that people with different understandings of the universe, from cradle to the grave, from family to the economy, from the environment. So that is not materialized anywhere yet, I think, but it's a, let's say, noble aspiration that would also trigger creativity. The reason it hasn't happened and taken root, I think, is, again, we need to take into the historical context into account that in the oldest democracies, such as Britain and France, for over 300 years, from the model parliament to the 600s, you didn't have any non-Christians. And for another 100, 200 years, you didn't, I mean, in the English case, you didn't even have Catholics, right? So it took a very long time, and it's still taking time to accept people of different sects and religions and worldviews. So I think it's important to go beyond just descriptive representation, which people, I think, rightly criticize as tokenism, to things like, we have different understandings of, yes, dress codes and food, but also worldviews, Weltanschauungen, to say it in German, right? And this should be integrated. And feeling native is critical for that. And that will benefit all European and non-European societies, because after all, I believe, the British and the French and the Turk and the Chinese and the Indian states would like people of different, faiths and languages to feel patriotic and nationalistic about being British, being French, being Indian, and for that they need to feel native, indigenous, and equal. To the extent that that happens, they will be more patriotically.
All right, let me ask a question to the middle, and anybody can take a stab at this, and we're continuing on this theme of multiculturalism. I mean, my question is, can it really survive as a political model in an era when we're seeing identity politics continue to really polarize our societies?
I think it has to survive, and I think what often politics gets blamed for the demise of multiculturalism. But really, the problem here is there's no alternative to the possibility of multiculturalism. And what old multiculturalism ultimately means, and I take the point that you made about how deep it can go, is simply imagining a future in which we can think about our communities as being layers of communities, a community of communities, rather than saying that you have to have something that looks exactly like this forevermore. And that, I think, needs to be done, and it has already been done in many ways. People live in very different ways now. People can go, and the thing about cuisine and things like that, there may be marginal points, but they're actually quite significant. Because where you have the possibility of multiculturalism, you also have the possibility of freedom, you have the possibility of justice. Now that is aspirational, but I think the idea that multiculturalism led to the right or the far right is not the issue. The far right decided to attack multiculturalism, and rather than those who could defend multiculturalism, the opponents of the far right, they simply have conceded the ground to the far right on every single issue. And what you have seen is, even in so-called social democratic states, the ratcheting effect, decade after decade, things have moved further and further away because you will never make enough concessions to satisfy the right. They keep on moving it. So rather than confronting it and so, no, they've said, okay, we'll give it up. We'll give up on the rights of immigrants. We'll give them the rights of gender. We'll give them the rights of all of these things. And somehow we will win something, and you win nothing. Yeah. And this is a political decision, and it's a political strategy, and it's been ultimately flawed, and you can see the fate of social democratic parties across the world, or that they're being devastated because people can no longer believe them because they have no answers.
I think sort of if we get into sort of deconstructing Eurocentrism, it's a whole different debate. We'll get to that. Marianne, I know that you want to follow up.
Yes, indeed. I think, diversity is a fact, and it's something we need to live with. And the far right has changed its narrative, especially in mainland Europe, being, at least in its image, less anti-Semitic, less anti-LGBTIQ. In reality, possibly still anti-Semitic and anti-LGBTIQ, I would say, and doing anti-Muslim bashing. What we need to be aware is that the far right in Europe has support from third countries, and some of them Muslim majority countries, and this is extremely scary to me. It's really a game that is dangerous, and many conspiracy theories against Muslims and against migrants are fueled by this. And in terms of diversity, we've seen that we have really rich legislation in the EU with framework decision against racism and xenophobia, a recent directive to empower equality bodies so that they are independent with resources. We have the Race Equality Directive. But we see that soft measures sometimes work better, and this is shown by a recent report on the legal framework of anti-Muslim hatred, on combating anti-Muslim hatred. Litigation doesn't always work, for instance, for a lady wearing a hijab. Now, what may work is actually soft measures, diversity charters for employers who are willing to accommodate diversity, or city awards for diversity. So looking at those who are actually willing to be on board and foster and cherish this diversity. Obviously, we need a combination of both, because we don't want states to crack down on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That should remain part and parcel of our countries. Now, on France, I just wanted to mention that paradoxically, if you look at figures of the Eurobarometer on non-discrimination, but also other reports, UK, when it was part of the EU, France and Netherlands rank among the most tolerant towards Muslims. It's also reflected in the FRA report, where it's not France being in the top 3 of those with a high level of Muslims perceiving a high degree of discrimination. It doesn't mean that we don't need to act in France. On the contrary, and we've seen the Netherlands also paradoxically having a very strong narrative, a very polluting narrative and very toxic one, reflected also in the aftermath of a football match. And we should be cautious about the whole range of EU member states. Some of them with very high percentages of Muslims, including Cyprus and Bulgaria. Some of them with very high figures, France and Germany, and autochthonous minorities such as the Tatars. So this diversity is historically part of Europe and will remain so.
Okay. I know that you want to follow up. I'm going to give you the
Very,
last
very,
word.
very quick question. I just want to pick up what Marian said euphemistically about third-party countries involved in this. I think we should also remember that some of the best Islamophobes in the world are Muslims, and we should also take that into account. Without that, we won't be able to understand the phenomenon.
Thank you. I do have a little bit of time, and I do, because we have you, the experts, up on the platform here. If anybody has a question from the audience, yes, if you can please stand up. Yes. Maybe get a microphone if you just identify yourself and the institution and...
Okay, my name is Sude, and I'm a student. My department is International Relations, and I want to mention something which concerns us as students. And I kind of would like to ask my question, and I'm curious about the situation since we are following and witnessing the rise of the far-right parties in Europe. And also, since we are a candidate country, we have some scholarships, rights, and we have to pursue our master's programs abroad, especially in Europe. But when we witnessing when the far-right party subjected to cordon sanitaire, and right now I wouldn't say that it still work or not. And also they're in the national parliaments, and since post-Lisbon they are effective and they have security rights. And also in the European Parliament they increased their seats. And when we examine their party programs and also their campaigns, we see Islamophobic rhetoric, and it concerns us a lot. And I would like to ask this question. As students who are willing to do masters in Europe, how we can claim our rights, and as the third country's nationals and students, what we should do and how it can be compensated. Thank you so much.
That's a tough one, perhaps. We have academia here. We have, yeah.
I think you should vote. You should vote, express your views, because in fact we see a lot of youth not going to the polls, and rising number of indeed members of the European Parliament from the far right, which leads also to I would say censorship of the file of anti-racism and the fight against anti-Muslim hatred. So we should make sure that everybody goes to vote and express their views. But also, I witnessed on Monday, I was in Germany at the German Islam conference, that there were a lot of initiatives on political training for youth. And this is extremely important. I've never seen it elsewhere in Europe. Maybe it exists. Including for Muslims, but also for non-Muslims, so that they're aware what is far right, because unfortunately we tend to forget what it leads to.
Madam, thank you very much. I have time for one more question, perhaps maybe from this side of the room before we come to an end of our session.
Thank you very much. My name is Hüseyin Baltacı. I am from Turkish minority of Western Thrace. On behalf President of Western Thrace Graduate Association President. So my simple question is, what can do, or what we can wait from European Commission so that in Western Thrace we as Turks and Muslims every day we are faced with hate speech. Every day we see our freedom of religion freedom and the freedom of being Turk in Greece. Every day we have troubles, and we don't know what to wait from European Commission. Recently we have here our elected muftis, and despite the fact that we elect them and we want them, the government doesn't have its own muftis. And of course, there is the Association of Turkish İskeçe Türk Birliği in Greece that despite the fact that European Commission is give the permission to live, to exist as a Turkish union, we cannot achieve our goal. So every day we want, we love, we have peace, we want to have peace. We are with multiculturalism, but I'm afraid that despite the fact that Greece is considered to be the cradle of democracy, every day we face this kind of trouble. So what can European Commission do for this? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hussein. And these are rights that are protected by the Lausanne Treaty as well.
Definitely, and indeed it's an important autochthonous minority, the Muslim community in Greece, which shows also that it's our identity for centuries. So I would maybe invite you to follow up with me. Obviously, there are competences of the states, but we can also have discussion. You can call on your member of European Parliament to ask us questions, and we will look together at solutions. I will also say that if citizens and member states want more from the Commission on combating anti-Muslim hatred, they need to state it. It's not going to come from itself. So please voice, and there will be an open public consultation in the few days on the upcoming strategy against racism, and there will be questions on Muslims. So feel free also to reply to this open consultation.
I know that you have a plane to catch, but maybe you can follow up. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Professor Aktürk, Salman, Marian, Ambassador Pachacha, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here on this session. We hope you have a good rest of the day. On a personal note, please allow me to extend my thanks and my gratitude to our hosts, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Turkey, Minister Hakan Fidan, all of the deputy foreign ministers, all of the secretary generals, all the ambassadors, all the staff over the ministry. It takes a lot to put on a conference like this. All the volunteers, all the staff, all the technical people, the list goes on and on. We thank you for all of your hard work for making this a success. I'm saying this because this is my last session for today and for this ADF. Thank you very much, and a round of applause to our participants. Thank you. Thank you. We have a short break. The next session begins in about 20 minutes in this hall. Thank you.